Hi everyone, it's Aishanette and I'm here to go over your Chapter 4 lecture on sensation and perception. In psychology, when we talk about sensation, we're really talking about the process of sensory information being detected by our body and processed by our body. And perception is the mental understanding of that information. And so the two work together to kind of create our sensory experiences. So again, sensation is kind of the process of receiving, translating, and transmitting raw sensory information. And so depending upon the type of senses or the sense that we're talking about, that data comes in different forms. Sound waves as opposed to light waves, as opposed to pressure or heat in terms of our touch. So the sensory data that comes in is taken in one form, and then what we call transduce it or translate it into a language that our brain can understand. And that's sensation. Perception is how we essentially select out pieces of that data, organize it, and then interpret it mentally to create a cognitive understanding of that information. Historically, we think of smell, sight, hearing, taste, and touch as our only senses. But in psychology, we also study kinesthetic senses, which includes kind of our movement, and we'll talk about where those receptors are. And then we also include our vestibular sense. And many of you who maybe like roller coasters or things of that nature, boating, your vestibular sense is kind of what that motion sense that we all have. Okay. So synesthesia is an abnormal condition in which your sensory experiences get mixed up. And so maybe you might see a sound, or you might hear a color, or you might taste a color. And that's kind of a mental thing or a cognitive thing, where somewhere that perception of that information is getting distorted, and so your senses are confused or mixed up. When we talk about sensory processing, in general, all our senses function in much the same kind of general manner, in that we have receptors scattered throughout our body, and each sense that we go over is going to talk about the specific receptors in those related locations for that sense. And those receptors are essentially the sites that detect the sensory stimuli for us to process and experience those sensations. Transduction is that process of converting the information into a language, in this case neural impulses, that our brain can understand. Our brain doesn't necessarily understand light waves. Our eyes transduce that information through the visual system in order to send neural impulses to our brain, which then our brain does in fact understand. Most of what our senses are doing is not just detecting, but they're also filtering out and they're screening out a lot of information. If you just pause for a moment and you think about all the sensory experience that's going on around you. So I have warm air blowing at my feet. I can feel that air on my feet. I can also feel the coldness in the room. I can feel my sweater brushing up against my skin. I hear my bunnies in the background. I hear the fan from the heater blowing. But for the most part, I hear silence because everybody's still in bed. But there is literally thousands and thousands of pieces of sensory data that our brains are processing. And as we learned about sensory memory, it's first coming in through our sensory memory, and we have to selectively attend to that in order to move that on to the next level. Essentially, in order for us to selectively attend, our minds also need to filter out and reduce all that sensory stimuli. And anybody that has ADHD or autism, they know that this is a very challenging task, and our minds need to utilize a lot of energy in order to achieve that task. So then our brains also need to code that information. In other words, they have to kind of determine, okay, so what information needs to go where? And they're going to route it off to the specific areas of the brain that process that information. So in our brains, we have various lobes, and each lobe is involved in different things. And the occipital lobe is in the back here, and that processes all of our visual information. So light waves and the interpretation of those light waves and colors are going to get processed and coded and essentially redirected toward our occipital lobe for processing. So here's some different brain areas that are involved in the experience of sensation. First of all, our visual information, as I mentioned, is processed in the occipital lobe. This is our temporal lobe, the purple lobe outlined here, and this is where we process auditory information. This is our parietal lobe, and in our parietal lobe, that's kind of where all of our sensory information is kind of consolidated and processed, and so it will be scattered throughout the body as well. Along the parietal lobe, we have what's called our sensory, here's our motor cortex, and this is our sensory cortex. So this actually line is incorrectly placed. It really should be placed over here. Our motor cortex is in our frontal lobe. And if you think about your motor, it's much more kind of deliberate and conscious. Motor is movement. So that's in your frontal lobe, which is controlling those deliberate conscious processes. And your parietal lobe is more of your sensory, kind of a main sensory lobe other than for vision and hearing. And that is going to be in our somatosensory cortex is going to be in the parietal lobe. And so the motor cortex is the area that kind of controls body movement. Somatosensory cortex is the area that detects body sensations. So again, throughout the body, throughout the brain, different areas are focused on different things. Hearing, vision, sensory information like touch, and then our motor or movement of that information in response to that sensory information. So just some more general background, psychophysics is an area of psychology where they study kind of the cross interplay between physics and psychology. What are the basic functions or concepts of nature that are occurring in order for us to psychologically understand and respond to those sensory experiences. And one thing that comes out of it is absolute threshold, where researchers have studied the actual smallest amount of sensory stimulation that we need in order to process that. So what is the most quiet sound that we can hear before we detect it? What is the amount of perfume or nasal stimulation do we need in order to smell or process like perfume or cookies baking or something of that nature? Difference threshold is what is the minimum difference that needs to occur for us to recognize that there has been a difference. So when I'm talking about like turning down a radio, how much does it need to be turned down before I notice that it was in fact turned down? Like maybe I'm arguing with my daughter about turn down the music or turn down the TV, and she says I did, but I did not detect it. The difference was not significant enough for me to detect that difference. Another thing is sensory adaptation. So sometimes if you go into someone's house, they might be immune to certain smells in their houses, or a farmer who lives on a cow pasture, he might actually, he might actually be kind of immune to the smell of the cows, and that's what we call sensory adaptation. When we don't have as much sensitivity to a particular stimuli because we have so much constant exposure to that, and so our brains need to kind of filter that out. Otherwise, they're expending a lot of energy on interpreting and processing the stimuli that's kind of constant. So what we do is we just adapt to it, we desensitize to it so that our brains can focus on other stuff that might prove to be threatening. So interestingly enough, with sensory adaptation, we aren't necessarily able to completely filter out all information. For example, with visual stimuli, we're particularly vulnerable to visual stimuli. And that's because, if you think about our vision, it's an important part of our survival mechanism. And so novel or changing stimuli, we don't really adapt to, because we need to recognize if there's a threat looming. And very intense stimuli like bright light, we don't really adapt to, again, because it might be indicative of a potential threat that it jeopardizes our survival potential. So definitely the limitations that we have are often in an effort to support our ongoing survival. But then one says, well, how can we adapt to pain? And we do, in fact, adapt to pain. If you've ever been in athletics or sports, or you're a runner, things of that nature, you actually end up kind of pushing past the pain. Or like for me, childbirth, I end up, birthing a child, which is the most painful, excruciating experience of your life. But then afterwards, you kind of forget about it and you're willing to do it again to birth another child. So part of how we can adapt to pain, even though pain is, indicative of a threat to our survival, is number one, endorphins. They help us so that we don't process or experience pain to the same degree that we would otherwise. And then another theory is the gate control theory, which suggests that our spinal cord serves as somewhat of a gatekeeper, and it determines what sensations it allows to go through to the brain to be processed so I understand it to be pain. And so there are some things that we can do to close those gates or open those gates. Like if you've ever had maybe a cut or something, you might be able to, on your finger, you might be able to squeeze your finger or rub on your hand, and that essentially helps to kind of numb or dull the pain that you're experiencing in your finger. And that's because those larger kind of pressure points that we're experiencing are shutting down the gate to the spinal cord such that it cannot send on the message of pain in our little finger. So pressure can often be a nice distractor for pain for specific areas. Additionally, we can mentally distract ourselves from it by doing something else. And, this is kind of an interesting dilemma. I have a cousin who has fibromyalgia, and so she's in kind of a constant state of pain. And when she's with her grandkids or she's doing other things, she's not thinking about it, so she's not really feeling it. But then when you ask her, how are you doing? How's your pain level? Somebody that has chronic pain, you're now mentally redirecting that energy toward the pain, and so now they might actually experience the pain again. So it's almost better to not ask someone in chronic pain how they're doing, because it kind of keeps their mind off things. And then finally, there's this kind of notion of phantom limb pain that also suggests a top-down processing of pain. In other words, from the brain down rather than just from our limbs up. And so top-down processing really does show that our brain can initiate the concept of pain. It's not just our fingers or our toes or our legs or our arms picking up pain from our outside environment and sending that sensory stimuli to our brain for processing. Our brain can actually process it, and we see that through phantom limb pain, where people who've experienced amputation still, in fact, experience pain. And so, just as if they had that limb still present, without any nerves or sensory receptors to pick up that pain, they're still very much experiencing the pain mentally. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and we will come back in just a couple of minutes. I'll see you in a bit.